justice for a new year. So, heartiest of 2025. Best wishes to our listeners.
Yes.
And Jade?
Yes, so I'm happy to be back somewhat. And I'm wishing the listeners...
I thought you said you're turning over a new leaf.
I hope the listeners had a good vacation. I hope that everybody is feeling refreshed for the new year as we are.
All right, so my name is Michael Jackson, Executive Director.
And I'm Jade Williams, Policy and Advocacy Manager.
Oh, you own the title. I love it. So, let me not bring my laughter to the radio, to the ears, because I don't think it's the best laughter. But Jade is now our Policy Research and Advocacy Manager.
Yes.
Yes. Good work being done. So, we have quite a bit to discuss. So, let's start with the obvious. We're moving towards a new legislative year that normally happens mid-February. And when you have the start of a new legislative year, before that, it means you have to close out what was on the agenda for the legislative year that is now coming to an end, that will see Parliament being prorogued. And there's some questions that we have to ask ourselves in terms of where we are with some critical piece of legislation. And I just want to pose a few questions to our parliamentarians that I think the country needs an update on the Domestic Violence Act. If you recall, there were some amendments that were made in 2023, in the December thereabout, that saw, for example, the fines for protection order being increased from $10,000 to $1 million.
Yes.
And there are some other changes that were made. But JFG and others had cautioned that you need comprehensive review of the Domestic Violence Act. And for those who are not aware, the Domestic Violence Act does not even have a definition of domestic violence. Yeah. And though the fines were increased, for example, for protection order, it still did not address the issue of what is happening with occupation orders. So we have been calling and urging the Parliament with the Joint Select Committee led by Minister Grange to get on with the work. The last time we wrote to the Parliament, we were told that no meetings were held or scheduled at this time. Mm-hmm. And that was in September, and we have not heard anything. And the reason for even mentioning that, if you listen to the Most Honorable Dr. Andrew Holness, when he was in St. Mary, providing a much-needed house for a citizen, he was really encouraging the citizens to play an active role. But to Dr. Holness, it also means that the Parliament, with the majority from your political party, also needs to ensure that the legislation is there. And there are some other pieces that we need to quickly touch on, Jade. We saw in an article from the Jamaica Gleaner today on this very issue about the Integrity Commission, the Joint Select Committee reviewing that piece of legislation. They have not met in about 5 months.
Right.
That's not to say that the Integrity Commission has not been in the news cycle, because we've seen a lot of commentary there, and we have cautioned that any proposal should see the Integrity Commission Act being strengthened, not weakened. And we urge the Joint Select Committee to put forward a report so you know what exactly is being proposed. And without commenting on the legal merit of the judicial review that has been brought forward by the Prime Minister, one has to really be considering what implications that may have for the Prime Minister's own political party that has the majority in the House, in terms of what would be put forward from that Joint Select Committee, and whether or not that process that the Prime Minister has absolute right to undertake. It may not look good, but he has the right, like any citizen, given some of what is being asked, in terms of striking down provisions in the Integrity Commission Act, I believe itself,
yes,
and some provisions in the Corruption Prevention Act. That I think may not look as palatable for the public. But the Prime Minister has a right, wherein if his reputation he believes is being harmed, to seek some judicial review. But the point is whether or not that will affect what we expect from the Joint Select Committee. And tied to that is the Protected Disclosure Act. That is the whistleblowing law that will ensure that, again, we support people informing, as long as it's safe to do so. We don't have this informer for dead culture. We need to get rid of it. So the Protected Disclosure Act will ensure that it is safer to do so. And we encourage people that if you see wrongdoing, then you put forward. So that legislation, again, that Joint Select Committee, we haven't heard anything. Similarly, the Unexplained Wealth Order. Well, we have heard something. We are being told that there may be constitutional concerns. And we had asked for the Minister of National Security, Dr. Horace Chang, who's also the Deputy Prime Minister, to actually put forward a draft, even if it's not a draft bill, a draft concept, so that it can be debated. So I think of immediate, that was the week that was for me, that I would urge our parliamentarians, Jade, and listeners to consider. Yeah? What is up for the new legislative year, and how are we closing out the current legislative year?
For sure. Thank you for that, Mikhail. So I think we can go into our topic for today, including the right of the day and the trivia question for today. And today we're talking about what would an Enhanced Securities Measures Act look like. So we're going to give a little background a little bit later on. But before we do so, we wanted to give you your Did You Know for today. And that is coming from the Constabulary Force Act. And that's part 2A of the Constabulary Force Act, and that speaks to extraordinary powers, special powers that the JCF has when it is trying to control and detect crime. So this section allows for, whereas most actions that the JCF undertakes has to be undertaken by a warrant, this section allows for those exceptional circumstances. So the JCF can, under this section, establish a cordon, which involves setting up a boundary area that controls movement in and out. They can impose a curfew, which would allow for persons to stay inside their homes at specified hours. They can search without a warrant, and that would be search of vehicle, places, homes. And if they suspect someone is committing a crime or has committed a crime, person as well. And the power to seize items. So where they find items that they think might be valuable to the investigation, then they may seize those items. So that section of the Constabulary Force Act gives those additional powers to the JCF. Now for Did You Know, we'll be asking the trivia question. Trivia question. Yeah, so for a trivia question for today, it is asking which piece of legislation governs the state of public emergency in Jamaica and allows for the related regulations to be made. So which legislation controls the state of emergency and allows for the regulations that come with a state of emergency to be made. So you can respond to that by sending a message at 2397583 or responding in the chat on YouTube or on our Instagram at JA4Justice.
Yeah. And in discussing the topic, ESMA, and what you can expect in the ESMA, Enhanced Security Measures Act, we're going to be joined by Professor Anthony Clayton shortly. And I'm happy that, Jade, you had that particular Did You Know, and outline some of the already established powers under the Jamaica Constabulary Force Act, because I believe at times people are of the view that, the police can't do much. And I think there perhaps needs, we can revisit whatever, improved or increased strengths there needs to be. But how do you balance that with human rights and civil liberties? You can't underestimate these things or say, crime rate high, so therefore lock up everybody, detain everybody, and so on. So we're going to be having that conversation. But before Professor Clayton joins, I've seen commentary regarding the reduction in murder rates. And I think it's important, and I said it on this radio station, that we congratulate the efforts of the Jamaica Constabulary Force. We congratulate their efforts in not only reducing the homicide rate and the count when you compare to the last 2 years, but we also acknowledge their efforts with the clear-up rates. There are some differences in definition at times, but the fact that you've seen improvement there, it means that the possibility of a matter going before the courts and the evidence standing up strong, and then what we saw, for example, with the Klansman gang trial, I believe it was, where you have people being convicted, that is what you want going forward. So we have to extend our congratulations to the Jamaica Constabulary Force. And when we criticize the government, we have to also congratulate their own efforts in giving the police the resources, not now SOE now, but the resources to get their work done. And I think we can say that there's greater effort to be done from the government and the ministry in this respect. Because when I heard, for example, from the Minister of National Security that, listen, some aspects of Jamaica I not working, I was a little bit concerned. So it means that greater work needs to be done going forward. All right. So I'm not sure if you have any views on that before we go to the break and we bring in Prof. Clayton.
No, we can go to the break.
All right.
If you're a homeowner looking to upgrade your space, a business owner in need of durable and cost-effective construction solutions, or an Airbnb host looking to make your guests more comfortable, Freeform Factory has got you covered. Their expandable polystyrene foam products are the perfect solution for building, insulating, and decorating your space in a cost-effective and durable way. Visit them today at 6 Nanspen Drive, Kingston, or 7 Harbour Street, Montego Bay, or call 876-757-2395. Freeform. Build, insulate, decorate.
Welcome back to Let's Talk Justice. Today we're hoping to we are going to be discussing ESMA and what that might mean for us, what those provisions might look like. And to have that discussion, we are joined by Professor Anthony Clayton, who is a professor of Caribbean Sustainable Development. Thank you for joining us, Professor Clayton.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Mikhail. Good afternoon, Jade.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon and Happy New Year to you.
Thank you.
Best wishes.
And the same to both of you. I hope you
Thank
have
you.
a blessed New Year.
Thank you so much. Now, before we get started, just to have the topic contextualized for the listeners, for example, in November 22, 2022, when the government was seeking to declare a state of public emergency, Dr. Holness at the time indicated that he would want to see the enhanced security measures passed before the end of the next parliamentary year, and this was in 2022. And at the time, Dr. Holness had indicated that the ESMA is actually being drafted and a cabinet submission, again, is expected. In terms of what Dr. Holness indicated would be in a proposed ESMA, in that same conversation in Parliament, he indicated a raft of issues. This was where the Prime Minister had indicated that, one, the country can expect significant increases to have what is now commonly called the mandatory minimum sentences for murder. In that same conversation, Dr. Holness mentioned that it is also important that the Fingerprint Act would also be amended to deal with some of the shortcomings. He also mentioned DNA. In that same conversation, Dr. Holness had mentioned the Bail Act, and the public is aware that since then the Bail Act was actually overhauled and replaced by a new Bail Act in 2023. In terms of what is expected in the ESMA, Dr. Holness had indicated, and I quote him here, This bill will include provisions for detention, for the establishment of a criminal watch list, and the use of control orders. That was what Dr. Holness had promised the country in November 22, 2022, and we've seen some other conversations since then. So, Prof, having heard that little snippet, what is your immediate in terms of what to expect from an ESMA? Are you looking forward to it, so to speak?
Well, we don't really have enough details. I can comment on the points that you've raised so far, but let me just add that this has actually been under discussion since, I believe, March of 2019.
Yes.
So it's now something like, 5 years now that this has been being discussed. And it does surprise me that it's taken this long. And we still don't know the details, because this potentially is a very significant legislative package, and will have a lot of implications for the fight against crime. And one or two aspects of it will also touch on potentially touch on some civil rights issues. So I believe it's important that there should be greater public awareness of what is being proposed, and the opportunity for a broader discussion before these measures are homologated into law. Having said that, there's a number of points here which people have been asking for a very long time, and which are long overdue. We needed reform to the Bail Act for years, and in particular, we needed clarity about the grounds for denying bail.
Yes.
In the UK, there were, for example, there was something like 6 grounds for denying bail at a time when there was no such equivalent provision in Jamaica. So I think that there was a gap there that has been now at least partially addressed. The use of fingerprints and DNA measures, again, is long overdue. If we could routinely collect DNA from crime scenes, it would be a lot easier to link together crimes, in particular where you have, for example, a serial killer.
Yes.
And if you can get the DNA traces which are routinely left at crime scenes, it's possible to link crimes together and identify a perpetrator. And this is something which law enforcement have been wanting for a long time. The Prime Minister also said, I think back in April of 22, that there's going to be a particular focus on young men, late teens, early 20s. This is eminently sensible, because that particular demographic is by far the most likely to be both the perpetrators and the victims of violent crime. So that's not controversial either. The one or two elements there where there might be some controversy, one of them is the rolling over of some elements from Plan Secure Jamaica, specifically the use of the emergency powers. And the second is how they intend to actually use the watch list, the crime control watch list.
Yes.
In essence, this is just a record of people who are considered to be high risk, either because they've got criminal records or because they've got known or strongly suspected links to organized crime or some form of criminal activity, including cybercrime. Now, in some countries, this includes what are called politically exposed persons. Then this is somebody who, through their position, is more susceptible to being involved in bribery or corruption. But this, however, might actually bring several high-profile politicians into the net. So it's going to be very interesting to see whether the watch list system proposed for Jamaica is going to include politically exposed persons as well, which it does do in other jurisdictions.
Because, Prof, one of the things, and you've said quite a bit, and just for the listeners to keep up, I want us to break down some of it. Because the Fingerprint Act and the DNA Evidence Act that I've heard being mentioned before, you spoke of it being amended in a particular framework, that the routine collection of fingerprints at crime scenes. My concern is if we roll over aspects of the SOE where innocent people in some instances are people who you do not have enough evidence to charge them. So you collect them, and I use the word collect loosely here. You collect these individuals, put them, as Jamaicans would say, Prof. You throw them in the back of a truck. You detain them for an extended period of time, collect their fingerprint, you don't have enough to charge them, and then you retain it. So there is almost a concern that these extraordinary powers could see people being detained, arbitrarily so, just to collect their fingerprint. And the question is, in a high crime rate environment, is that a balance or a reasonable expectation? And that's one question. I have another regarding the watch list, but let me ask you to answer that.
All right. Well, the real interest is, in fact, not fingerprints, it's in DNA.
Yes.
Because as we go about the place, we shed skin cells, strands of hair, and so forth. We shed all the time. And if you can pick up enough trace of any of the sweat or the skin cell or something like that somebody's left at a crime scene, then you can get, with a very, very high probability, a match to a particular individual. So if you routinely collect, and this would be probably something like a saliva swab.
Yes.
Just put a little, like a Q-tip in somebody's mouth for a minute. Take a little sample of saliva. So non-intrusive, not painful, doesn't involve needles. But if you then ran that through your database and discovered that somebody with the same DNA was at a dozen different homicide scenes, then you could be pretty confident with a very high degree of probability that the person you had in custody had in fact been at all of those crime scenes. Now that doesn't establish that they were the ones who committed the murder. There may be other reasons, innocent reasons, why they were at those crime scenes. But it does mean that you've got very good grounds for taking a very serious look at that person. If you're worried about the potential for some kind of abuse of the system, then it is possible to say that after a certain period of time, that DNA samples should be destroyed, that they should not be retained indefinitely. But they could be retained for long enough to allow you to run a check against all the crime scenes for which you had taken DNA evidence from the site to see if there was any connection.
Yes.
So yes, there are possible risks, but I think it's actually perfectly possible to devise an appropriate regulatory framework to make sure that there's less potential for abuse.
Yes. And I think my recommendation in this is the threshold to be established for the police to detain you and then take DNA sample and so on. I'm happy that you mentioned that, Prof. Another thing that you mentioned with the watch list, which is a database of sort of high-risk individuals, including politically exposed persons, would tie to the issue of the unexplained wealth orders. And I'm not sure if you've been following the updates in that respect, but I'm not sure if you could draw some connection for the listeners regarding unexplained wealth orders and how that could connect with the conversation about the politically exposed persons.
Well, this is a deeply troubling issue. When politicians talk about the crime in Jamaica, quite often they really want to confine the conversation to street crime, to violence in particular. But there is another form of crime which actually does even more economic damage to Jamaica, and that's the problems we have with corruption. And that goes right into the heart of our system of government. So this is why the the whole issue around unexplained wealth orders and politically exposed persons was so crucial to the fight against crime in Jamaica. And this is something which regrettably, deeply regrettably, the government appears to have turned its back on. As you know, the government has decided that we don't need unexplained wealth orders. I beg to differ. I think we need them now more than ever before.
Because
And we
currently
also-
the laws deal with, forfeiture of assets only if you're convicted. But the UWO would have a broader framework. So
Yes, it's actually not so different. I mean, you don't lose your assets unless the court decides
Absolutely.
that there is no reasonable way that you could have come by these assets legally. So, in other words, if you've accumulated vast, really substantial amounts of wealth, and you absolutely cannot or will not, or you refuse to account for it, then and only then, and after weighing the evidence, is the court entitled to conclude that this is probably the proceeds of crime, and it can then be seized. But if all you have to do is produce the will in which your great aunt left you the money, or a copy of your winning lottery ticket,
Yes.
or a letter from your broker explaining what a genius investor you've
But
been.
you
All
can't
have
say
to
that you
do-
accumulated $40 million and you had it under your mattress.
Absolutely. All you have to do is provide some kind of evidence to demonstrate how you came by this money. And it doesn't matter how rich you are, provided you came by it honestly. The only people who don't like unexplained wealth orders are the people who really do not want to account for where their money came from. And that is in almost every case because they did not come by it honestly. And that is why the unexplained wealth orders would have been such an important addition to the fight against crime and corruption in Jamaica. And I think it is very unfortunate, to put it mildly,
Yeah.
that the government is now saying we don't need this, because I think
Or let's pause
that
on
the
it.
recent controversies indicate we need it more than ever.
Absolutely. Prof, just stay with us. We're taking the break and then we pick up with some other elements around special detention orders and so on.
It's Monday, get over your blues. Or Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. The E-Zone is here for you. With this thing, Honeybee.
And Karim Boyatings
From 3 to 5 p.m. on Nationwide 90 FM.
We've got your entertainment news.
Then we want to hear your views. Why you said?
Jump in the mix.
Or the hot seat.
Don't miss our brain
Or
busters.
the crazy giveaways.
Let's talk fashion.
Send us your outfit of the day. Ooh, cutesy. Very demure.
Are you looking for love?
Come on one of our blind dates. Send your request to ezoneblindates@gmail.com. That's ezoneblindates@gmail.com.
And stay tuned for your confessions.
These are my confessions.
Share them with us at ezoneconfessions@yahoo.com. I mean, is this planet Earth?
Is it?
I don't know. Let me check. Either way, it's got a buzz.
And a bugger thing.
Ow! Ow!
Welcome back to Let's Talk Justice. We have been discussing ESMA, what that might look like, and other elements in our legislation that might affect the proposed provisions. We are joined by Professor Anthony Clayton, and before the break, we were discussing the unfortunate decision not to prioritize unexplained wealth orders by the state. But I know Mikkel had some further questions on special detention as was proposed by Dr. Holness.
And, listeners, before we move on to to that. I know, Prof, we were having the conversation about the watch list and that database. But if we if we look at other jurisdiction, Australia, United Kingdom, it also speaks to things like surveillance and tapping conversations and so on. So it's for us here. The devil is in the details for JFJ, because a lot of these types of legislative provisions are grounded in anti-terrorist laws. And I know we utilize the language of domestic terrorism and so on, and we have to tackle crime in the country. But again, I'm a little bit concerned when I just hear these buzzwords being used without greater indication from the government what exactly will be in the ESMA. And how do you ensure that the threshold can be met, wherein, I'm not driving through an area that you've declared to be high risk, and then I'm caught up because you don't have sufficient evidence and you're using intelligence. So it's the safeguards, Prof, that I'm a little bit concerned about, as you can appreciate.
Right. Well, there are some safeguards. For example, if the police want to run a trace on your phone, they have to go and get a warrant from a judge, and then they have to take that to your cell phone provider. So they can't just go and do that by themselves. They have to produce a justification and convince a judge that it's necessary.
Yes.
However, if we are going to go further down this road, then I think we should actually consider strengthening that procedure. And there's a model that's used in France, where you have about 7, in the whole country you have about 7 or 9, something like that, specialist counter-terrorism judges. And the idea is that we have this model where, although obviously judges have their own specialist areas of expertise, we don't specialize to the same extent as they do in France, where you have judges who actually spend their time studying these criminal structures or terrorist structures and keeping abreast so that they are familiar with their personnel, their ideology, their politics, and their and recent changes in current affairs and so forth within these organizations, so that they are then able to make a much more informed decision to a request from the security forces to put some particular person under increased surveillance, which might include monitoring their cell phone metadata or use of the internet or people that they meet with. And if you're dealing with a situation where if you get this wrong, you might miss somebody who's going to blow up a public building and kill a lot of people. So the stakes are exceptionally high. We, thank God, do not as yet have that problem. But we have also got a level of homicide that has been in and out of the top spot in the world.
Yes.
We're dealing with a level of homicide which is so far out of the norm. It is absolutely extraordinary. It never, it really amazes me. But levels of homicide have been falling around the world since the mid-1980s. There's only about 20 countries of which that is not true. And we, unfortunately, are pretty much at the head of that list.
Yes.
Everybody got excited when our level of homicide fell by 19% from last year to this.
Yes.
But if you actually do the math, our level of homicide would have to go down by 19% for the next each year for the next 11 years before we got back to the world average level of homicide. So we are so far out of line that you could conclude, yes, there is a genuine case for looking at the trade-off between the kind of civil liberty that you would expect to enjoy in a society with a much lower level of violent crime and the measures that the government could ask people to put up with for a time-limited period.
Yes.
And this, I think, might answer your concern. The problem with enhanced security measures is that once they're in place, they tend not to go away.
Yes,
And
that is the concern, Prof. When you
Right.
give politicians power, hardly you find someone who's willing to say, I've been equipped with such extraordinary powers at the executive branch that I'm willing to give it up.
Well, this is the problem. There are not many examples of people voluntarily giving up powers that they have been granted. When the Crime Monitoring Committee was looking at this and looking at the introduction of enhanced security measures, in particular neighborhoods, the committee actually developed a structure to say that if your government was going to bring in enhanced security measures, it would have to be triggered not just by a political decision, but it could be triggered only if the level of homicide went substantially above the national average for at least 2 quarters. And then that the state of the special provisions would come to an end once the level of homicide was back down to the national average and had remained there for 2 quarters. Now, that wasn't the exact mechanism, but it was something along those lines. In other words, it's actually tied to what's happening in the community. It's evidence-based, it's data-based.
I'm happy you said that, Prof, because one of the proposals that we made with the mandatory minimum, and we could also look at this when we see the tabling of ESMO, is what you call a sunset clause. So we know that these are extraordinary measures. So it sets a time to say after 3, 4 years, 5 years, these particular pieces of legislation will expire. It will come to an end. And it then forces Parliament to review. It's not like other pieces of legislation like the Access to Information Act that has not seen a review for decades, or other legislation they put a timeline in and Parliament just ignore the period stipulated. Because it stands the risk of expiring now, it forces them to actually review with the evidence that you articulated. And I think that would be a recommendation from JFJ, that you include a sunset clause in the ESMO when it's tabled.
I think that's actually a very sensible, and that should actually be used. That approach should be used more generally for government legislation. That if government introduces legislation to address a specific problem, we usually forget that the whole idea is to solve the problem, i.e., that you should get to a time when the problem has gone away. And at that point, the legislation should actually also go away. Now, the mechanism then usually is we say, well, okay, once you've achieved a certain, whatever it is you're trying to achieve, level of representation or level of homicide or whatever, and it's been that way for, say, a certain period of time to make quite sure it's stable, at that point, the legislation will expire.
Yes.
It might be easier just to say, okay, every 2 years or something like that, there'll be an automatic review. And the presumption is for it expiry unless it is specifically renewed. So that sort of mechanism would actually make sure that the legislation that remained in place as long as it was necessary.
Yeah.
As you probably know, we have some very inactive parliamentarians who put in some of the shortest hours inside Parliament of most legislatures. So I don't think this would be asking too much of them to actually turn up and do an automatic review.
Yes, not
of
37
legislation.
sittings and you turn up for 3.
Well, that is really an abuse, and people should really question why we had to now pay these people double what we did until fairly recently when their productivity has not gone up.
Yes.
So I think it's not unreasonable to ask parliamentarians to actually turn up occasionally and participate in these reviews and to retire legislation that was no longer justified. And like I said, the whole object of the exercise in many such cases is to solve a problem. It's not to put in something in place that is has to then remain on the statute books forever.
Yes.
Once the problem is solved, we can then stand down the legislative provisions. They can be reactivated if the problem recurs. But once there's no longer a justification for them, we can stand them down. And
Another
especially
thing,
when you're talking about something where we might agree as a society for a certain period of time to put up with a certain level of inconvenience, a certain level of encroachment on our normal civil rights, provided that this is justified by the circumstances and provided that we're no longer asked to pay that price once the problem's been solved.
yes. Another thing I want us to touch on, Prof. Clayton, is the issue of special detention orders. And I want to paint a picture for the listeners and before I ask the question. So last year we saw the repeal of the Bail Act of 2000 and it was replaced with the Bail Act of 2023. It allows for both pre-charge bail and pre-charge detention. That is when there is not sufficient evidence to charge a person. You can be placed on bail conditions and be released within your community, your house, and so on, or you can be detained. And I looked back and the period was not actually closed for pre-charge detention. I have to take the break, Prof, but I want to explain the pre-charge detention before I ask you the question. Just stay with us for a few more minutes, please.
Sure.
Stop buying expensive toner cartridges. Global Ink is now selling new factory direct generic toners. Remove factory seals, install and print. Engineered to work first time, every time. Certified for use in HB and Brother printers. Worry-free, affordable printing for your peace of mind. Money saved is money earned. We deliver island-wide. 754-7444 or 1-888-NEED-INK. Never run out of toner again. Global Ink.
Welcome back to Let's Talk Justice. We're joined by Professor Anthony Clayton discussing what would a proposed Enhanced Security Measures Act looks like. But before the break, I was about to ask a question, but was just giving a little bit of an explanatory note. The Bail Act and the provision around pre-charge bail and pre-charge detention. Now, while Prof had mentioned before the importance of judicial oversight in ensuring that you mitigate against any possible police abuse, I go back to what is provided for in the Bail Act. Now, the Bail Act, on the surface of it, would seemingly respond to the issue of judicial oversight. But because of the changes to the legislation, Prof, there are some offenses you knew before the court had to review your matter for bail. And Jade can correct me if I'm saying anything wrong at this point. So murder, is a serious offense. But what is interesting with the Bail Act is that certain offenses, provisions under the anti-gang legislation, lot of scamming and so on, has now increased the powers of the police to issue bail, or the bail conditions for a particular period of time. And I go back to the point, Professor, that the details would be what is important for ESMA to work in the way that you're outlining, because I'm a little bit concerned that you're going to be, the legislators are going to be saying that, listen, for murders and those serious offenses, it remain with the court. However, You know that with the increase in crime rate, there are also amendments being made to other pieces of legislation, firearm and so on. And those pieces of legislation, some provisions thereof, could see your civil liberties being denied by police. And that is what I have a concern with. Who actually execute these special detention orders and these control orders? That would say, for example, I suspect you of a crime, stay at home. Don't go to this workplace. Only talk to these set of people. That's the control orders. And the special detention orders would be the equivalent to a pre-charge detention. I'm not sure if you have any advice about what safeguards could be put in place to mitigate any abuse in this situation.
Right. Well, let's go quickly into a little bit of the background for this. One of the big problems that we have had for a long time in Jamaica is the killing and intimidation of witnesses. There are the police don't usually have much trouble getting information from the public, but they find it very difficult to get people to agree to come and actually give evidence in court, because the bad guys are often able to get them intimidated or in some cases murdered. So it's long been necessary to have some kind of mechanism, and although it's very controversial, but for arresting somebody and holding them under pre-charge. Now, this means that there's not as yet sufficient evidence. The police have not managed to collect enough evidence to charge this person formally. Let me just come on to the rest of your question very quickly, because there's actually three conditions, as you rightly mentioned. Pre-charge, post-charge, and in fact, post-conviction. But the pre-charge one is probably the most controversial, because this means you're being held as if you had been arrested, but with not being yet formally charged. But then we don't really want people having to be held for a long time as if they had been charged without any charge at all. So the question then is, should they then be released on pre-charge bail? In other words, they have been released from jail with certain conditions, usually restrictions on their movements and so forth, and restrictions on what they're allowed to do, with the idea being that this then allows the police to continue their investigation. We, however, have to, I think, probably have some kind of time limit on this. And the other concern...
For example, in United Kingdom, Prof, which is what we had recommended to the Bail Act, was that the UK, which was the only jurisdiction we could readily find with what is called a pre-charge bail, they actually had it for up to 28 days.
That's right. And there's no question there of somebody being held for 3 months, 6 months, a year, or whatever, while the police look for evidence. It's time limited. I believe there's actually provision for a renewal of the 28, but that would not normally be granted, and it would only be given if the police provided to the judge really convincing evidence that this person would kill the witnesses or some other similarly problematic
and that's similar in our Bail Act, except it's 6 months and then you go to the courts for another 6 months for bail. But Prof, I think the point that I was making very quickly was that when it comes to pre-charge detention, whereas the pre-charge bail clearly has that time limitation, for pre-charge detention, I went back, Jade, you were correct. It seems that they haven't closed that gap, and the concern I have, how long can the courts hold somebody, detain someone without charging them?
This, I think, is a real problem. I mean, this is really a fundamental principle of justice, that you cannot be detained indefinitely without being charged and without having an opportunity to defend yourself. And I think the 28-day idea is a reasonable compromise. If you've got somebody who has a somebody, for example, who has a history of violence and intimidating witnesses, that you may say it is absolutely necessary to keep this guy off the streets until we can assemble sufficient evidence to charge them. But 28 days is not an unreasonable period of time. I think that once you start talking about very significantly longer periods, then it does raise real concerns. And the other issue is
Actually, among the police as well.
I beg your pardon?
I was asking, would it lead to lethargy among the police personnel where you have this provision for an extended period of time? Why
Well,
rush with my investigation?
You have to ask why. Yeah, seriously, what are you doing in that 6 months? Now, we know that the police, and until very recently the courts as well, probably still the courts, take an inordinately, or can take an inordinately long time to process evidence and to bring and to organize cases. But the solution for that is not just to lock people up for great or extended periods without charging them. The solution for that is to just get better at what we're supposed to be doing. One of the problems that has been bedeviled us for so many years is that the JCF did not used to be very good at putting cases together. Mm-hmm. And there were unscrupulous attorneys as well who would assist their clients to evade justice through the practice of judge shopping and so forth. So our system was cumbersome, it was slow, it was inefficient. Some of our judges had a very unprofessional attitude to the management of their court. And one of the problems here is that it was effectively impossible, it used to be effectively impossible to dismiss a judge for incompetence. In other jurisdictions, judges are frequently dismissed for being unable to manage their courts properly. Mm-hmm. And this is not seen as political interference. It's simply because they cannot maintain the level of productivity that is required to run an efficient justice system. So these are the actual problems that we need to fix. We can't solve those problems just by putting somebody in a jail for 6 months, 12 months, 18 months, 24 months without charging them. So no, we actually have to build a more efficient forensic system. We need more detectives. We need more lawyers attached to the police force so that we can have well-constructed cases being brought forward. We need to bring the DPP's office up to strength. Last time I looked, they had less than half the number of prosecutors that they needed. And we need to have clear performance requirements for the judges in our courts. Now, if we can do all of these things, then we should not need to be keeping people for longer than 28 days.
We have to leave it there, Prof. So last word, yes. All right, okay. That was Professor Anthony Clayton. Prof, thank you so much for spending some 45 minutes with us. We are really grateful for your insight.
You are most welcome, and I wish you both again a truly happy and blessed New Year.
Thank you so much. So just to wrap up, what JFJ is calling for is for the government to table the Enhanced Security Measures Act and ensure that any increased powers, one, there must be a sunset clause, as we highlighted earlier, where there is an expiration date that forces review about whether the act is necessary for continuation. The right of appeal must be included where citizens can appeal any such special detention order and so on. And of course, ensuring that judicial oversight is properly outlined in any such legislation. So the government ought to move with haste so that we can stop the back and forth and we can rigorously
scrutinize these
scrutinize.
provisions.
Yeah.
So I wanted to just clarify two things. Saw some comments coming in our YouTube chat. The first I want to address is regarding repeat offenders and bail. Just to say that one of the reasons for denying bail in Jamaica is that the person has previously offended or has a criminal record. That is one of the considerations that the court can look at when deciding whether or not a person should receive bail or whether or not they should be placed on bail with certain conditions. Another thing I wanted to quickly address was regarding a question on the Data Protection Act and whether or not that would cover evidence that's covered at a crime, collected at a crime scene. No, the Data Protection Act within itself would not speak to that. What could happen, though, is that in an investigation where DNA evidence or other sensitive personal information, as defined by the Data Protection Act and the National Identification Registration Act, that DNA could be compared to that data that is held in the database for needs. And if it is going to be compared in that way, it would be within the standards in the Data Protection Act. So that is the only way in which that legislation and that routine policing and collecting data would really interact in that way.
So in other words, while they have a broad privacy right as outlined in data protection, some of the specifics now would be outlined in other pieces of legislation.
Absolutely. And just to say, our winner for trivia today was news commentator. The question was which legislation speaks to states of emergency and the related regulations, and that is correctly said by her, the Emergency Powers Act.
News commentator, winner of 2025.
Yes, indeed. Yes.
All right, so it was a good episode. I hope we learned from it.
Most certainly.
And while we, support the government, the parliament in any legislative making, we have to ensure that we balance. Striking the right balance is important. Addressing crime and security concerns, but of course ensuring that human rights are protected. So that is it for today. So see you next week.
Absolutely.
All right, name is Mikkel Jackson.
And I'm Jade Williams.
Have a good week.
Jamaicans, for justice, the people's champion. Justice for all. Justice under the law. Justice, Jamaica demand. Right to life, right to liberty. Out of many, we are one in a Jamaica. Make it a better place for the boys and girls. Created equal by the creator. For equal rights and opportunities. No to unlawful detention and police brutalization. Class, gender, race or religion. We not tolerate discrimination.
To join the fight against injustice, contact us at 755-4524 or JamaicансForJustice.org.
The people's champion.
It's Monday. Get over your blues. Or Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. The E-Zone is here for you. With this thing on Honey Bee.
And Karim Boyatings
From 3 to 5 p.m. on Nationwide 90 FM.
We've got your entertainment news.
Then we want to hear your views. What you said?
Jump